go. Hello, good morning or afternoon to everybody. It is my sort of delight and joy to introduce the next title, which is Facing Crisis, Art as Politics in 14th Century Venice. And the person who will be speaking to you, with you today is Stefania Gerevini, who is the Associate Professor in the History of Art at the University of Bocconi. And this book is really interesting. It starts with a real sort of question, which is that Venice in the 14th century was faced with a whole bunch of crises, natural disasters, internal dissension, external wars. And in response to these various sort of challenges, the response was to fund a lot of really lavish, expensive artwork, which is probably not the sort of first thing that most of us would think a government does in the time of crisis. And yet they did at San Marco. They constructed a new altarpiece, the Polidoro, a chapel to San Isidoro, and a new baptistry. And it is Stefania's contention in this book that these represent a sort of new visual constitution for the Venetian Republic, and that these aren't sort of a weird strange decision on the part of the government to um, dump all their money into art in a time when maybe they should have been dumping money into, who could say, but this actually was a sort of redefinition of what the Venetian state was. Um, with that, I'll turn it over to Stefania to talk to you more about the book, and then we'll have a sort of more organic discussion. But I do want to encourage people at any time, if you have any questions to ask or comments to make, drop them in the Q&A or drop them in the chat, and we'll incorporate them as we go. So, Stefania.
Oop. I'm here. I'm just trying to turn on my camera, and I apologize for the sort of very temporary setting you're seeing me in. I'm traveling for research. So thanks everyone. And before introducing the book, I just like to reiterate my thanks to Colin, who, in addition to agreeing to be my chair today, has been a wonderful editor for the book since its very, very beginning. So I'm delighted that we're both here to talk to you about Facing Crisis. So as Colin mentioned, Facing Crisis, Art as Politics in 14th Century Venice examines three monumental projects that were commissioned by the Venetian government between 1343 and 1455 in the Church of San Marco, and asks one seemingly straightforward question, which is, what contribution does art make at times of crisis? And before introducing my argument, it bears outlining the historical context a little bit in more detail. So by the mid-14th century, Venice was, as we probably all know, a leading global power. And yet, between 1340 and 1355, the city, as Colin briefly mentioned, faced famine, plague, a violent earthquake, fierce military conflicts with Genoa and with the Ottomans. And internally, it tackled dramatic political tensions, including a coup and the public execution of a doge in 1355, as non-noble citizens were gradually excluded from public office. And so, strikingly, it was during this very period of acute crisis that the government initiated a series of ambitious artistic projects in the state church of San Marco. So there were three of them: a new baptistry, a chapel dedicated to St. Isidore of Chios that were lavishly decorated with mosaics. In addition, the high altar, which provided religious focus for the faithful, was revamped at this time. And this included turning its uniquely precious golden altarpiece, which this audience is certainly familiar with, the Pala d'Oro, into a spectacular moving machinery that would open and close to reveal different images daily and on feast days. So these projects required substantial public spending at a time of financial strain. And they hardly represented business as usual, so to say, for the Venetian policymakers. So instead, and this is the key argument of the book, they were a central part of the government's wider response to crisis. So the thesis of my book is twofold. At one level, I argue that these new projects revealed the range of pressing concerns that engulfed the Venetian government and people at this time. So, for example, the painted altarpiece that was displayed on the altar of San Marco on non-festive days exhibits an emphasis on human suffering, on miracles, on saintly interventions that is unusual for Venice, and that may relate the need for reassurance of the community in uncertain times. The bloody conflict against Genoa is very likely to have influenced the dedication of the chapel, newly built chapel to St. Isidore. The saint's body was transported to Venice from the Greek island of Chios, which was at the time a vital Genoese stronghold. So to the people of Venice, the physical presence of St. Isidore's relics in San Marco may have provided reassurance and the promise of protection and victory as the state engaged a risky conflict. And finally, uncertainty about the nature and boundaries of citizenship and political authority, which the expansion of Venice's overseas territories transformed into an ever more urgent problem, offer a valuable way to interpret the imagery of the baptistry. Here, the apostles are rendered in mosaic as they baptize the nations of the earth, and so they offer an idealized image of union and diversity. So this is one possible reading, but I also suggest a second interpretative layer or angle, which is that the projects sponsored by the Venetian government during this period represented the active exercising of the political imagination. So in ways that some of us may find alarmingly familiar, Venice's ongoing instability made traditional approaches to decision-making, communication, and control ineffective in dealing with the challenges that the city faced at this time. And Venice's governors responded to the crisis which threatened the very survival, the stability, the sense of integrity of the city and its very political foundations, with a wide-ranging strategy of legal, institutional, and historical revision, which were aimed at clarifying the nature and functions of the Venetian state and the responsibilities and limits of authority of its organs. So the government reaffirmed Venice's civic laws, for example. It reorganized its international treatises. The authority of the Doge, so the head of the Venetian state, was progressively restricted. And over time, the government clarified the rules for holding public office. Also, the first official history of Venice ab origine was completed in 1352. In this context, the San Marco projects did not merely express the anxiety of the Venetian community or the hopes for renewed stability, although they did that too, but they represented the establishing of a new political landscape, which was envisioned most clearly on the east wall of the baptistry, and I'm sorry you're not seeing it right now, but in this mosaic, the religious scene of the crucifixion incorporates the Doge of Venice kneeling at the feet of the cross and two lay officers, which are more difficult to identify, but were arguably representatives of the different organs of the Venetian state. So these three secular figures are depicted as kneeling supplicants within the monumental mosaic of the crucifixion, blending the sacred with the secular. This image offered an abstract, oh, thank you, Colin, that's wonderful. This image offered an abstract state portrait that simultaneously expressed a political reality and suggested a new political ideal, and I'd be happy to discuss this further in the Q&A. The mosaic now rendered Venice's Doge as a humble ruler, as a supplicant, and it represented the business of government as a collective enterprise. He is not alone in the mosaic, he is with the other members of government. So in so doing, this image articulated a new vision of the state and of government as public service and shared responsibility. And this idea, which developed through political reforms in Venice and from broader debates in other medieval Italian city-states at this time, went on to influence Western approaches to government and public life to this day. So Venice's state-sponsored artistic commissions were not propaganda in the modern sense. Instead, what I argue is that they offered a compelling visual reflection on the nature of leadership and the necessary limits of authority. They kindled a new vision of government that enabled Venice to navigate one of the most turbulent phases of its history, and reminding us too of the power of the arts to inspire and to imagine new futures in difficult times. So thank you. This was a brief, but I hope brief introduction, but I hope it gave you at least an idea of what the book is about.
Thank you. So like I said, if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A or the chat. I'd like to start by asking the sort of one of the big questions, which is how, this is a Byzantine book festival, and we've been talking a lot about Venice. So sort of the art obviously is inspired, or at least sort of takes a lot from Byzantine sort of traditions. What does that say about the sort of Venetian attitude towards Byzantium at the time, or Byzantine art? And then, like you said, a lot of these ideas get filtered through Venice into sort of Western European tradition. And sort of what do you see the sort of connection to Byzantium in that respect also?
Thank you, Colin. So obviously the sort of Venice and Byzantium querelle or question has been central to art historical debates for a really long time. And this book sits within a long and time-honored tradition. As Demos very famously wrote, the history of Venice is the history of its relationship with Byzantium, which ran the whole gamut from subordination to dominion, to domination. And so I suppose my book both builds on that scholarly tradition and challenges it in a few ways. So based on Demos's interpretation, scholarship on Venice and Byzantium has for a long time identified 1204 and the Fourth Crusade as a defining moment in the history of both polities, obviously, but also as the origin of Venice's triumphant ideology vis-a-vis Byzantium, an ideology that in turn has been interpreted or has been seen to manifest into an artistic rhetoric of spolia, especially in the Church of San Marco. So the projects that I have examined in the book have been largely interpreted within that tradition. So as sort of a long-term consequence, let's say, of 1204, and as variants of this Venetian ideology of triumph, so appropriative ideology, and as a visual manifestation of Venice's victory over the empire. Now, the point of departure of the book was obviously that by the mid-14th century, the geopolitical balance of the Mediterranean, as well as the relationship between Venice and Byzantium, had profoundly changed. So obviously, Venice continued to interact with the Eastern Roman Empire, but its power in the Mediterranean had increased. And also Venice entertained intense continued relationships with other Western and Eastern interlocutors, including Greek-speaking and Orthodox communities in its home colonial empire, so polities and communities that had been Byzantine and were now Venetian. So inevitably, the terms of the question, Venice and Byzantium, must be posed differently when we think about the 14th century. So at one level in the book, I seek to move beyond the traditional Venice and Byzantium querelle, and beyond the idea that references to Byzantine art in Venice in the 14th century inevitably manifest an ideology of triumph and victory. But at another level, obviously, I advocate the centrality of Byzantium in Venice. So what I do is I try to redefine what Byzantium is by this time. And so I do not take Byzantium as an exact synonym of the Eastern Roman Empire, but as a more expansive scholarly label or scholarly category that refers to the entangled and layered histories of interaction between the empire and its neighbors and successors, and between, which include Venice. So when we understand Byzantium in these terms, then the category, so Byzantium and the Byzantine, is central to Venetian identity in the 14th century. The Eastern Roman Empire, as well as the other Greek-speaking and Orthodox communities which Venice interacted with, informed Venetian artistic and social identity at this time. And by the same token, Venice played a key part in shaping the artistic and architectural language of these communities throughout the Trecento. So I guess to put it shortly, the Venice and Byzantium question is central to the book, but it is also posed from a slightly different angle than it has been traditionally discussed.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple questions from the audience. I'll start with one from Tessos Pavkostas. He says, congratulations. It says, congratulations, Stefania. You mentioned that the choice of St. Isidore may have to do with the Genoese and their rule over Chios, whence the relic came to Venice 2 centuries earlier. Surely there were in mid-14th century Venice other relics of much more prominent holy figures who could have been honored with such a lavish chapel. Does the Genoese connection explain this choice fully? Could there be any other reason for Isidore? Says, no doubt the answer is in your book, which I will read as soon as possible.
Thank you, Tassos. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the question. Absolutely. So my point of departure when thinking about the Chapel of St. Isidore was puzzlement, because obviously the Church of San Marco had been reserved for the body of the evangelist for a really long time, and for relics in the treasury, which were primarily relics of the Passion, but no other holy body, which Venice was otherwise very rich in, was buried and honored in San Marco. So there were smaller relics and body parts in the treasury and the body of the evangelist. So by the 14th century, Venice had obviously acquired several other holy bodies which had scattered around the city in other sanctuaries. So why is it that precisely at this time, in the mid-14th century, they decide that St. Isidore, which by comparison with other holy bodies in Venice was a relatively minor saint, deserved being buried in San Marco and honored with a new chapel in the State Church of Venice? And the chronological coincidence is quite incredible, because actually what Andrea Dandolo, the Doge of Venice at this time, mentions in the Chronicle is that the body had been in Venice since the 12th century. So Doge Domenico Michiel had imported the relic on his way back from a crusade and from Tyre. So he had made a stopover in the island of Chios and allegedly appropriated the body. But the body of St. Isidore and his cult are not attested in Venice until the mid-14th century. And they are right at the time when the conflict between Genoa and Venice is on the rise and explodes in the mid-14th century and in 1350-55. So I think, I'm reluctant to say that it explains the choice and the building of the chapel and its visual decoration fully. But I think it was a wonderful opportunity for the government of Venice to sort of prop up the importance of the cult of the saint in the context of this conflict. The argument that I advance in the relevant chapter is also that, again, the chapel works at two levels. So on the one hand, it is a form of visual propaganda in the context of the Venetian-Genoese war. But there's another layer where the chapel also represents a canvas to think about the authority of the Doge. Because the mosaic cycle in the chapel represents Doge Domenico Michiel, so the Doge who originally appropriated the body of the saint repeatedly and in different capacities in the chapel. And so there is, as it were, a two-layered agenda in the visual program of the chapel. On the one hand, speaking and thinking about Venice and Genoa and their relative position in the Mediterranean, and on another level, the role of the Doge within the Venetian Republic at this time.
Great. I think we have time. We have 1 minute left, so if we could answer really quickly. Colin Hendleman asks, do we know anything about the artisans responsible for these works? Were they local Venetians or did they come from elsewhere?
Well, the briefest answer I can provide is I wish we knew. With the mosaics, it is really, so with the Chapel of St. Isidore, it is more likely than they would have been local artisans. With the baptistry, both a Byzantine and a local local artisans or local manufacturer have been argued, but there's no evidence either pro or con. Obviously, with the high altar, it's a little bit easier because we know that the painted altarpiece, the Pala Feriale, was painted by Paolo Veneziano, so local artist, and the Pala d'Oro itself was originally Byzantine, but was modified in the mid-14th century by a local goldsmith. So that's all we know.
Great. Thank you so much, Stefania, and thank you to the organizers of the third annual Edinburgh Athens Byzantine Book Festival.
Thank you very much to all, and thanks, Colin, again.